There is a moment, very early into Rhythm Heaven Fever, that I want to highlight for you, because it's not only the moment that had me completely sold on the game, but it also serves as an example of what makes the Rhythm Heaven series so unique. It's this moment right here. Did you see that? If you didn't, that's kind of the point. But if you've played enough rhythm games, you've probably picked up on what's happening here. And that is because, in this moment, Rhythm Heaven Fever changes one of the core design principles of the rhythm game genre, and in doing so, becomes one of the most interesting rhythm games I've played. But we'll come back to that in a moment, because to understand why this moment is significant, we first need to understand how rhythm gameplay actually works. Unlike a lot of other genres that have mutated and evolved over time, eventually birthing entirely new gameplay systems and subgenres, rhythm games have largely existed in their default form for almost as long as the genre has existed. Wait for two circles to overlap, press the corresponding button when they do, and now repeat that 800 times, using the rhythm to fine-tune the timing of your button inputs to maximize your score. Now, maybe it's a little unfair to describe the entire genre in such a reductive way, but I actually think rhythm games had a lot less room to evolve compared to most other genres. Because while other genres eventually benefited from having more advanced gameplay systems, hardware, or just general game design innovation, I think rhythm games more or less perfected their formula very early on. This format of having the notes move from one end of the screen to the other until you need to press the appropriate button, which we will refer to as a beat map, is a very efficient way of conveying what's important for this kind of game. And while it does feel a little too upfront about its intentions at times, like the game is giving you a clear picture of exactly what it's doing behind the scenes, I'm able to look past that fact because the core gameplay across almost the entire genre is still really fun. So why am I talking about this today? And how does it relate to the example we started the video on? Well, something I find kind of interesting about rhythm games is that a lot of rhythm games rely a lot more on their visuals for their core gameplay rather than their music. While you are timing your button inputs to the beat of the song, you're still relying on the beat map to know exactly what buttons you need to press and when you need to press them. Meaning that being able to see the beat map is ultimately what the crux of the gameplay is built around. Remove the beat map from any of these games and you're essentially playing with even less information than if you played any other game without visuals. Now, I understand I'm casting a very wide net with this observation, and I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions you could point out, but at least in my experience, this is how the vast majority of rhythm games are designed. And just to be clear, my point isn't that this is a bad thing. Like I said, these games are still a lot of fun. If you want any proof of that, one of the best games I've played this year is a rhythm game. I'm just pointing this out because I find it interesting. But now that you can see and understand for yourself how heavily the genre depends on its visuals for its gameplay, you can probably see what's so interesting about this moment from Rhythm Heaven Fever's tutorial. That's right, the game is actively hiding the beat map from the player, and it isn't just in this tutorial either. Across the entire Rhythm Heaven series, even all the way back in the first game on the Game Boy Advance, there's hardly anything you could call a beat map in sight. The only exception to this is in the practice mode, where you're given an indicator of when exactly to time your button press if you're struggling. But by showing us this indicator, we can see that the core of Rhythm Heaven's gameplay is still built around the same formula as the rest of the genre. So my question for this video is, since Rhythm Heaven goes out of its way to hide the system the genre is essentially built around, how does this influence the way it's designed? Since even a seemingly small change like this is going to affect the core gameplay pretty significantly. Well, considering the most obvious difference between the two is in the visuals, we may as well start by highlighting exactly why the visuals of your average rhythm game work so well. One of the nice things about a standard beat map is that it lets you read further ahead into the song than the segment you're currently playing. This amount varies from game to game, and it's never more than around 1 to 2 seconds of notice, but because the beat map is always moving, even though the player only knows which notes will come up in the next 1 to 2 seconds, they always know which notes will be coming in 1 to 2 seconds. This means the player is able to plan ahead regarding how they should position their hands, which can be very helpful in games with unconventional control methods, how they should adjust their timing, and which buttons they should expect to press in the future. And as you approach the upper limit of rhythm games that typically look like this, having that amount of foresight basically becomes a necessity. But since Rhythm Heaven doesn't have a beat map, this foresight isn't something the player can rely on anymore, at least for the most part. It isn't pushing into bullshit unfair territory where you're given zero indication of what you need to do ahead of time, as if you just crop the beat map right up until the end and then called it a day. There are still clear indicators for which button needs pressing, and you're still given an appropriate amount of notice. And even in the few cases where you're not, the one button control scheme most minigames use means you always know which button you need to press, since you know, there's only one button. But even though the games will usually show you clear wind-up animations before you need to press the button, not having a clear indicator of when exactly a button press is required, or even when the wind-up is going to start, gives the games a unique sense of unpredictability. And since you're not given a perfectly clear idea of what you need to be doing in the immediate future, you need to stay on your toes to anticipate whatever the game throws at you. Keep in mind, this unpredictability is something the game is designed around. Like I said, it isn't at the point of being unfair. Well, most of the time it isn't unfair. And even though each song often asks you to expect the unexpected, they still set up some pretty hefty guardrails to show you what you should expect, if that makes sense. One of the unique selling points of the Rhythm Heaven series is that every song is entirely unique in terms of both visuals and gameplay. Kinda like how WarioWare minigames work, just with a lot more substance. And since each minigame is so distinct from each other, almost all of them start with a pretty forgiving tutorial to help you get used to the cues they'll be asking you to respond to, with usually about 2 unique cues for each minigame. Looking at a minigame like Hole in One as an example, the first cue shows the monkey prepping the golf ball and waiting 2 beats before the player needs to hit it, while the second cue has a different wind up and a slightly different timing, this time waiting for a 3rd beat. And once the player understands the cues and the minigame starts for real, the game then asks the player to respond to the familiar cues in an unfamiliar order or context, which actually feels pretty satisfying once you've gotten the hang of it. Now, explaining the specifics of what makes every minigame across the entire series satisfying would be woefully uninteresting and would go on forever. So for the sake of time, I'm going to group the vast majority of minigames into 2 broad categories that we'll call reading and responding and staying on balance. There are obviously exceptions to this. Some games have elements of both, some games have elements of neither, but let's just stay on topic for now. Reading and responding games are exactly what you'd expect from that description. You see the cue, and then you respond to it. Sometimes the game shows you a handful of cues and you need to repeat them back to the game like Simon Says. To be honest, these are some of the more basic minigames in the series, not to say they're all boring or just straight up bad, but I also don't think you need me to break down the gameplay of Exhibition Match. You can understand how it works by just looking at the footage. These games do still have ways of creating a satisfying challenge though. One of the more common ways is forcing you to respond to the cues while staying off the beat, which is a lot harder than it sounds, at least for me. Slightly less common is when they force you to respond to cues, or a handful of cues, in only a fraction of a second. But I think my favorite is when they ask you to respond to a cue in complete silence. It's probably the most unfair of the 3, but for some reason, I just think it's really funny. Staying on balance games are instead built around pressing the button to the beat with a consistent rhythm, and being able to maintain that consistency for the entire minigame. While these games use visual cues as well, most of the time they exist just to show you whether or not your timing is off. There's basically no wind up to these animations, outside of a few exceptions, but since you're pressing the button in time to the beat, that's almost always okay. But just because they're about staying on beat doesn't mean they're easy. Remember, I called these minigames staying on balance, because the challenge of these minigames actually comes from the ways that they try to throw you off balance, usually by slipping additional cues into the middle of the song that force you to break your own consistency shortly before asking you to get back on rhythm. But these breaks still work in your favor most of the time. They're given clearly telegraphed wind-ups, so it's easy to anticipate ahead of time. They're shown on top of the standard gameplay, so it's easy to transition into the new timing. And with the exception of Lockstep, they generally don't ask you to break consistency for that long. They also act as a brief pause to the consistent rhythm, which can often serve as a moment of rest from the amount of focus the rest of the minigame asks from you. And as these minigames go on, and these breaks in consistency become more frequent and more jarring, it feels like you're always right on the edge of messing up until the song finally ends and you have a chance to breathe. It's probably not surprising to hear based on that description, but these minigames are some of my favorites in the series. So even though you're not given a 100% clear clear indication of when you need to time your button presses, you can hopefully see that with the time you get to understand the gameplay, the clear lead-in before each button input, and the formats each minigame follows, that even though the series breaks from the standard rhythm game formula, it's still able to provide a fair and satisfying challenge that still feels very unique to Rhythm Heaven. But there's another side to this challenge that I've only touched upon so far, because while it's true that Rhythm Heaven's unique visuals give it a kind of novelty and charm that helps set itself apart from other rhythm games, this is not actually what the gameplay is built around. Maybe you've already picked up on what I mean by that, but if you haven't yet, let me give you an example. Another common way the minigames try to throw you off is by distracting you with their visuals, usually by having eye-catching things taking place in the background, foreground, or in the same plane as the characters you're supposed to be looking at. The most noteworthy example of this, at least in my mind, is the minigame Air Rally. You're having a good time, playing badminton while flying a plane, as you do, when all of a sudden the gameplay is obscured by the textbook definition of visual noise. Something like this would be difficult enough to deal with on its own, but this minigame also has two different cues. Since this is a staying on balance minigame, the first just asks you to hit the A button every other beat to keep the rally going. It's pretty easy to manage. But the second cue interrupts that rhythm by having your partner do a high shot, forcing you to wait one extra beat before hitting the A button. Normally, this isn't too difficult to deal with, but when you get to this part of the minigame and you can only see your own silhouette, you don't know when you'll need to press the button because you can't see what your partner is doing anymore. So, bearing in mind how frustrating all of that sounds, you're probably wondering how I'm still able to play the minigame so well in spite of what's going on. And the reason for that is, I'm not actually looking at the gameplay. Something I haven't told you yet is that the visual cues Rhythm Heaven minigames are built around also have audio cues that are associated with them. For the staying on balance minigames like Air Rally, the first cue usually doesn't have a sound associated with it since you're supposed to be hitting it on the beat of the song. There's not really a need to indicate the timing once you've learned how to maintain a consistent rhythm. But the second cue that's supposed to interrupt that rhythm does have a sound associated with it. One that has a clear lead in to when you need to break your consistency and readjust your timing. So even when the screen gets obscured with clouds and you can't see what your partner's doing, you're still able to tell when you need to be pressing the button by just listening to the game's audio. Now, this was obviously a very extreme example, but you can see this kind of thing happening across the entire series, even in the minigames with less, we'll say, invasive distractions. I'm not going to break down every minigame that works like this, since I think you can get the general idea from the example I chose to focus on, but the thing I really like about these distractions is that they encourage the player to actually listen to and play along with the rhythm of the rhythm game. And I think this approach to design kind of fits the rhythm game format better than most other rhythm games. Because like I said at the start, for a lot of these games, it doesn't really feel like the rhythm plays that much of a role in how the game is played most of the time. You're still relying on the visual information the game presents you with to know when you need to press a specific button, which isn't really helped by the fact that the visuals of these games are often so over-designed that everything blends together, but that's not what this video is about. Seriously though, why is everything on this screen the same shade of blue? But because Rhythm Heaven is built around its sound design, it means that playing the game without seeing what you're doing isn't just an interesting challenge, it's an actual gameplay strategy. One that, if you're struggling, is more often than not the thing that'll help you get through some of these minigames. Hell, if we go back to the example I showed at the start of the video, this is how they tutorialize the gameplay. They clearly want you to be playing like this, at least in some capacity. And personally, I think that is just a much more interesting way of designing this kind of game. And a big reason for that comes in how Rhythm Heaven uses its visuals for things that aren't directly related to gameplay. Specifically, in how they kind of serve as a reward for the player. Not just for getting good at the game or playing more of the game, but also for being bad at the game, in a weird way. Now, this point might be a little difficult to get across in video form, so just bear with me on this. Since the distractions of these minigames are purely visual, it means you're technically free to look wherever you want while playing Rhythm Heaven, since most of the time, you're not on the lookout for the visual indicators telling you when to time your button presses. Granted, on your first time playing these minigames, you're probably too focused on staying on rhythm to fully process what's happening on the screen in front of you, but after a few replays of each minigame, following the rhythm starts to become second nature, and once that happens, you realize that whatever was happening on the screen was something really stupid. Now, like I said, appreciating this aspect of the series is kinda hard to do through a YouTube video, since if there is something weird happening on the screen, as a viewer, you're more likely to be focusing on that rather than the rhythm of the game audio that you probably can't even hear right now anyway. But when you're actually playing the game and you suddenly realize what you were looking at this whole time, it catches you so off guard that it's likely to make you lose rhythm all over again. And that experience almost becomes a part of the joke itself. But once you've regained your composure and you've gotten back on rhythm, you start to appreciate the forms that these distractions actually take. Sometimes they take the form of Easter eggs from the previous games. It's kind of fun. Sometimes they're just a little bit cute, like this monkey in the blimp that definitely hasn't made me fail a perfect attempt at this minigame before. Sometimes they're so bold in how they distract you that it becomes the joke, like when Samurai Slice forces you to watch the minigame's entire backstory as you are playing the game. But I think my favorite distractions, even if they're among the least distracting in the series, are the handful of songs that have proper lyrics. Not only because they make the gameplay more satisfying as you're playing in time to an actual song, but also because they're just really good in their own right. Though some of them are a little stupid, I will admit. I don't care though, I think they're great. In fact, I think we should make Frog Hop the national anthem. But even for the minigames that aren't going out of their way to inconvenience you like this, as funny as that is, it can also feel satisfying to just play the minigames without making any mistakes. More so than the actual rewards you get for getting a perfect rank on a minigame. Everything just flows together so well, to the point where it doesn't even look like a video game at times. It just looks like a really cute piece of animation playing in time to some music. And completing an entire minigame without disrupting this flow is kind of a reward in and of itself, which also provides a direct contrast to what failing at Rhythm Heaven gameplay looks like. Since every minigame also has a unique set of animations for when the player misses a cue. These obviously serve the boring gameplay purposes of telling you if you suck at the game, but since they're also kind of funny, they almost serve as their own kind of reward. And considering how often you'll fail as you get used to some of these minigames, they also provide a much needed form of levity to help offset the frustration of learning how the heck you're supposed to play Monkey Watch. And this unique approach to handling the successes and failures of the player kind of makes this feel more accessible than a lot of rhythm games I've played. Or at least it feels less strict. Because as good as I think rhythm games are, failing at them at all kind of gives me the impression the game is disappointed in me. Like, I miss one note even a little bit and it feels like I'm getting a chair thrown at my head. Even if I don't miss any notes, missing the timing even a little bit runs the risk of negatively impacting my score, like I'm not quite playing on its tempo, and maybe that's just me. I mean, it's a meaningless number, and I don't care how high I am on the leaderboard, I just don't enjoy feeling like I'm bad at something. Which, you know, obviously that's not the game's fault, but you know what I mean. Rhythm Heaven, in my opinion, just does a much better job at being approachable to people of all skill levels, or even the people who are still learning to play the game. When you're succeeding at Rhythm Heaven, it's satisfying because it doesn't even look like a video game. And when you're failing, it's satisfying because it's cartoon characters getting physically abused, something that is universally entertaining. The unique gameplay structure of the series also serves to turn these animations from a cute and silly novelty into an actual gameplay incentive. Rather than having a handful of minigames unlocked from the start and unlocking more as you work your way through your backlog, Rhythm Heaven is structured a little more like a platformer, which, considering this is Nintendo, probably shouldn't be too surprising. The games are split into a handful of level sets, usually with around 4 minigames in each, and you move through each minigame in a sequential order, with each level set being capped off by a boss stage of sorts. And this rigid linear structure can be a little frustrating at times, since if you're stuck on a particularly annoying minigame, the only way to progress through the game is to beat that minigame. But I think being forced to unlock each minigame in a specific order like this helps to turn the minor points of the series presentation into their own reward, because you're not playing through the game just for the sake of unlocking all of the songs. You want to see what crazy concept it'll be built around, how it'll try to throw you off, how satisfying it is to play it perfectly, and how funny it is when you make a mistake. And because each game is so varied in terms of theming, you never know what you're going to see next. In fact, some of them almost defy explanation with how weird they are. Imagine trying to explain Donk Donk to someone who doesn't know anything about Rhythm Heaven. This linear structure also serves to give the gameplay a kind of payoff, again like a platformer. Similar to how Mario World ends with lava castles and boss fights, Rhythm Heaven tests the skills you've built through its level sets with a remix. A level that combines the minigames leading up to it, asking you to respond to all of their cues as they come up in an even more unfamiliar context. Something which doesn't really lend itself well to YouTube videos either. To clarify, I'm not editing the footage here. here. Those cuts to black are what it looks like when the remix switches from one minigame to another. So since this is probably terrible to look at for an entire segment of the video, I'm just gonna stick to showing the normal minigames. The thing I like about the remixes is kinda similar to what I like about the standard minigames, just on a slightly bigger scale. The game teaches the player how to respond to the situations it presents, maybe it throws in a few surprises on top of that, but since you mostly know what to expect, the surprises become an interesting and satisfying challenge. Only now, you're being asked to respond to 4 minigames at once, now with an added layer of unpredictability. Since, outside of the occasional audio cue, there's nothing to really indicate when a switch is going to happen. But those switches aren't really that hard to manage either, because in most cases, you know there are only 4 different minigames the remix can switch between. Minigames that you likely just finished playing to get to that point, maybe even multiple times if they were really throwing you off. And the remixes act as a way to test your knowledge of those minigames, sometimes even forcing you to deal with new situations that draw on the cues you're familiar with. Just like, you know, an actual boss fight. I don't think the remixes are really doing anything that new or innovative, either within the rhythm game genre or within the Rhythm Heaven series itself, since they are basically just 4 standard minigames in a trench coat, but I do still appreciate them for how they choose to interpret the concept of a rhythm game boss fight, because I think it's cool and I think they handle the concept really well, even if it does feel a little jarring the first time you see them. However, while I obviously like a lot of things about this series, I can see why it wouldn't appeal to everyone. Because the gameplay of the series is so heavily designed around responding to these cues, and you need to give the player at least a little bit of foresight to do so, this means that even the fastest Rhythm Heaven minigames never reach the level of intensity you'd find in basically every other rhythm game. And if that is what you've come to expect from rhythm games, then I can understand why you'd find Rhythm Heaven to be underwhelming by comparison. And it's a similar story for the music too. Rhythm games live or die on their soundtracks for a lot of people, and Rhythm Heaven can also feel pretty weak in that regard. The music is rarely pushed to the forefront of each minigame, I think because they didn't want to distract from the sound effects that games are built around, as well as to fit the generally more relaxed pace of the gameplay, which I think works for what it is, and if you're looking for music to use in YouTube videos, it's basically free real estate. But considering the kinds of soundtracks it's up against, even I will admit I vastly prefer one of these over the other. I know it's kind of weird to end the video by criticizing the thing I've just spent the last 15 minutes telling you about, but it's part of the reason why I think Rhythm Heaven is so interesting. By making what feels like a small change to how the game is presenting information to the player, it ends up changing a lot more about the core gameplay than you'd probably expect. And their approach to handling those changes came with their own strengths and weaknesses that I don't think necessarily make it better or worse than a conventional rhythm game. So even if you don't think you'll get on with Rhythm Heaven for the reasons I listed above, I think the changes made to the formula make it interesting enough to at least be worth experiencing for yourself. Especially now that the new game is, well, it's probably already out by the time you're watching this, let's be honest. But whether or not you're interested in playing Groove for yourself, I at least hope that you found this video to be interesting, which I assume you did. I mean, I doubt you'd watch to the end if you didn't, unless you really wanted to hear me ask you to like and subscribe for some reason. Please like and subscribe. I don't want to talk your ear off about what I'm planning to do next, since my schedule is subject to change, but if you want something to watch until next time, I figured I should mention here that I stream twice a week over on Twitch, and once I'm able to get my hands on Rhythm Heaven Groove, I'm planning on doing a tier list stream ranking every minigame across the entire series. So if you're interested in hearing my thoughts about that, come check it out sometime. Okay, shameless promotion over. Back into the script writing minds I go.